The transmission began as static, a thin whisper of distortion crackling across the edges of known space. At first, the listening stations along the rim thought it was just another fragment of background noise, the echo of stars colliding or the resonance of some pulsar too far away to chart. But then the static steadied, resolved into something that had never before graced the airwaves. A Zalari distress call. The Zalari were not the type to ask for help. Their entire culture was built on pride and war, on duels that lasted days, on songs of conquest sung by children before they could even walk. They had fought empires into dust, outlasted centuries of sieges, and laughed at the notion of diplomacy. They considered mercy weakness and weakness death. So when the words came, shaky and desperate, it sent a ripple of unease across every listening post. From the icy edges of Europa's relay stations to the orbital citadels over New Shanghai, the words were simple. Send us anything. We're getting slaughtered. Not a detailed report. Not a request for reinforcements or supply lines or allies bound by ancient treaties. Just 4 words repeated again and again like a chant from a voice on the verge of breaking. The transmission included no coordinates at first, just raw panic wrapped in static, until someone at Deep Space Command noticed the subtle fluctuations in the carrier wave. It was location data, stripped bare, as if encoded in desperation by someone who had only seconds before their comms were torn apart. The Council convened immediately. Not the Zalari Council, they were unreachable, perhaps already gone, but the United Terran Council, summoned from every time zone, dragged from warm beds and tense diplomatic dinners. They met in Geneva's central chamber, a dome of glass and steel, its walls alive with projection screens showing the transmission over and over again. On every replay, the same words. Send us anything. We're getting slaughtered. Admirals frowned. Diplomats whispered, and the chairwoman of the assembly, a tall woman with sharp lines around her mouth from years of negotiating with species who thought smiling was a sign of surrender, asked the only question that mattered. What could slaughter the Zalari? No one had an answer. The Zalari were, by every measurable statistic, the apex predators of the known galactic community. Their war fleets could blacken skies. Their infantry, augmented and bred for combat, were known to fight until their bodies simply failed. Their enemies feared them. Their allies tolerated them. No one had ever heard the word slaughtered attached to their name. The military representatives argued first. We must send ships, they said. A fleet, something to prove solidarity. If the Zalari fall, whoever is doing this could come for us next. Others shook their heads. No, they countered. If the Zalari are falling, then sending our fleet is suicide. We would be feeding men and women into a grinder that's already chewing up one of the most powerful civilizations in known space. The diplomats suggested sending medicine, weapons, supplies, advisors. The scientists recommended reconnaissance drones, stealth probes, anything to observe before committing forces. But time pressed down on them. The transmission was already days old by the time it reached Earth, and in war, days meant systems could be erased. Planets burned to glass, survivors turned to ash. The chairwoman tapped her fingers against the table and finally said, the message was clear. Send us anything. They didn't specify ships or soldiers or aid. They asked for anything. Her words fell heavy in the chamber, and it was then that someone from the archival division raised a hand. Not a general, not a diplomat, but a quiet archivist who handled cultural exchanges, relics traded in goodwill with other civilizations. We have something, he said carefully, though it's not practical. Every eye turned. He explained about the vault, about the cultural artifacts humanity had kept, replicated, or even constructed. Some were works of art, monuments, libraries of sound and sight. Others were weapons, or at least representations of them. Humanity had a strange relationship with fiction. They built the things they dreamed of, even if only once, just to prove they could. One of those dreams was a star destroyer, not a metaphorical name. Not a title slapped on a battleship, but a literal recreation of the vessel from an old Earth mythos, designed first as entertainment and later resurrected by engineers who wanted to see if such an absurd design could exist in reality. It had taken decades, and the result was an ungainly behemoth, triangular, city-sized, bristling with weapons that had no peer in current technology simply because no sane navy would waste the resources to build something so vast and single-purpose. It had been built once, launched as a marvel, toured as a wonder of engineering, then decommissioned because the upkeep was monstrous and the tactical value questionable. It sat now in orbit around Saturn, mothballed, its hull gleaming in the pale light, more a monument than a weapon. "Send them that," the archivist said. Laughter broke first, incredulous and sharp, but the laughter died quickly because the truth was buried in the words of the Zalari transmission. They hadn't asked for specifics. They hadn't demanded a fleet. They had begged for anything. And if there was one thing humanity knew, it was that sometimes symbols mattered more than strategy. The council debated for hours more, but in the end, the chairwoman stood, her voice carrying the finality of law. "Prepare the destroyer. Translate the manuals into Zalari script. Send it to their coordinates." And so the great machine was awakened. Technicians swarmed it, dusting off decades of silence. Its reactors hummed again, a low growl that rolled through the void. Its weapons, untested for years, lit with green fire as diagnostics ran. Crew bays, long empty, were scrubbed and sterilized. A Zalari crew, escorted by human liaisons, arrived within days, their eyes wide as they looked up at the monstrous wedge of steel and fire that would be theirs to command. They had never seen anything like it. Their own ships were elegant predators, curved and angled for speed and intimidation. The Star Destroyer was none of that. It was blunt force given shape, an iron fist with no subtlety. Where Zalari ships were sleek and proud, this thing was terrifying in its indifference. It did not look like it had been designed to win battles. It looked like it had been designed to erase the very concept of resistance. When the Zalari commander first stepped aboard, he turned to the human advisor and asked, "What do you call this monster?" The human smiled faintly. "A Star Destroyer." The words made the commander pause. He whispered them to himself, as though testing the flavor of them in his mouth, and then nodded once. Preparations took only a short time after that. The ship was stocked, armed, and launched. It cut through space with the arrogance of a god, bound for the coordinates where Zalari fleets had been broken. And as it left the Sol system, as its shadow passed over the rings of Saturn and blotted out the light, humanity watched and wondered. What could possibly make the Zalari beg for help? What horror would meet this Star Destroyer in the dark? And what would happen if the universe learned that humanity had pulled monsters from its own dreams and built them into reality? The answer lay ahead, carried on the thrumming engines of a ship born from fiction, now hurtling into a war where myths would become weapons and desperation would become destiny. The voyage to the Zalari frontier was longer than the humans expected. The destroyer was massive, and though its engines were powerful, the ship had been built with human tolerances, not Zalari impatience. To the warriors now commanding it, every hour spent in transit felt like a lifetime wasted. They paced the corridors, ran their clawed hands across the smooth, angular walls, and muttered to each other in voices full of both awe and doubt. The ship was enormous, yes, and armed with more firepower than anything they had ever seen. But to their eyes it was alien, foreign, not born of their traditions. They had fought their wars in vessels built like extensions of their bodies, crafted to sing with them in battle. This thing was cold, unyielding, a slab of steel that answered to no song and sang no glory of its own, yet they could not deny the aura it carried. Even silent, even empty of battle, the Star Destroyer filled them with a kind of dread that they had never felt before. It was a weapon stripped of poetry, of elegance, of honor. It was designed to crush, and there was a dark strength in that. The human liaison, a captain named Reeves, did what he could to translate the ship's systems into Zalari terms. His job was not easy. The Zalari wanted rituals, codes of honor, explanations of how the ship would sing their enemies into silence. Reeves had none of that to offer. He showed them buttons, levers, data screens glowing with green lights, and diagrams that spoke of power delivered not with grace, but with sheer overwhelming force. One Zalari warrior, his skin marked with the scars of 20 campaigns, slammed a fist against a console and growled, "This ship has no soul." Reeves smiled grimly. "No, it doesn't. That's the point." The warrior said nothing more, but his eyes lingered on the firing controls with a new kind of hunger. As the ship drew nearer to the coordinates, fragments of reports reached them from the surviving Zalari fleets. Whole armadas had been broken. The Vakar were unlike any enemy they had faced before. They moved like shadows through space, their ships darting in and out of cloak, striking with surgical precision. They did not fight for honor, nor territory, nor vengeance. They fought like predators playing with prey. The Zalari, so used to overwhelming their enemies with direct force, had been undone by an opponent who never met them head-on, who always struck from behind, from below, from the blind spots they refused to admit they had. Every message carried the same sense of disbelief, as though the warriors could not believe their strength had failed them. Some of the transmissions ended mid-sentence, cut off by sudden screams, by the tearing of hulls, by the silence that followed annihilation. By the time the destroyer emerged from its final jump, the Zalari frontier was a graveyard. Wreckage floated in endless fields, lit only by the faint glow of distant stars. Ships that had once been the pride of their empire now drifted in broken pieces, their steel torn open, their banners shredded and lifeless. The Star Destroyer's sensors picked up no living signals at first, only debris. But then, faintly, voices emerged. Scattered survivors, trapped in escape pods, clinging to whatever remained. The Zalari commander, his voice low and heavy, ordered that the survivors be collected. Reeves watched as the massive hangars of the destroyer opened, swallowing hundreds of battered pods at once, pulling in warriors who looked less like conquerors and more like ghosts. Their armor was scorched, their eyes hollow. Some carried weapons still clenched in hands that shook from exhaustion. Others carried nothing at all, their will to fight stripped away by the horror of what they had seen. One survivor spoke of the Vakar ships, long and blade-like, slipping in and out of invisibility like flickering phantoms. Another described how the enemy seemed to anticipate their every maneuver, as if reading their intentions before they acted. A third, half mad from lack of oxygen, whispered that the Vakar had no pilots, that their ships were alive, feeding on fear. Reeves tried to catalog the accounts, but there was little consistency, nothing concrete to build a strategy from. All that was clear was this: the Vakar had broken the Zalari in a way no one thought possible. The commander stood before his gathered warriors in the Star Destroyer's cavernous briefing chamber, a place once designed for humans but now echoing with Zalari voices. "We were slaughtered," he admitted, his tone bitter with shame. "But now we have been given a weapon not of our making. The humans have sent us a monster. It does not care for honor. It does not care for song. It exists only to destroy. And perhaps that is what we need." The warriors murmured in agreement, some reluctantly, others with growing hunger. Reeves listened in silence. He knew what they were beginning to feel, that strange intoxication of raw, impersonal power. The realization that with this ship they might not just win, but erase their enemies in ways that would be remembered in whispers for generations. The first true test came only hours later. A Vakar raiding fleet appeared at the edge of the graveyard, sleek black ships shimmering into view from their cloaks. They did not approach cautiously, for they had grown arrogant in their victories. To them, the Zalari were already broken, their pride shattered, their defenses crumbling. They did not know yet what waited in the shadow of the wreckage. The Star Destroyer powered its weapons. The Zalari watched in silence as banks of turbolasers lit with furious green fire. Reeves felt the deck rumble beneath his feet as the ship came alive, its systems responding like a beast shaking itself from slumber. The first volley erupted, blinding beams lancing across the void. In an instant, 3 Vakar cruisers disintegrated, their shields collapsing under firepower no one had thought possible. The wrecks spun apart like toys, their fragments scattering into the graveyard of their victims. The surviving Vakar tried to scatter, but the destroyer tracked them all at once, its targeting systems locking with ruthless precision. Volley after volley followed, endless streams of light pounding through the darkness. The Zalari shouted in exhilaration, their voices echoing through the halls as ship after ship was torn apart. What had once been an unstoppable predator now looked fragile, pitiful, unable to withstand the fury of this new monster. Within minutes, the battlefield was silent again. Not one Vakar ship remained. The Zalari commander stood at the bridge's viewport, his claws pressed against the glass, his breath heavy. "The humans have given us a god," he whispered. Around him, his warriors roared in triumph, their shame burned away by the intoxicating blaze of victory. Reeves felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had seen this reaction before, in different forms, in different wars. It was the moment when desperation turned to something more dangerous. Belief. Not belief in themselves, not in their honor or courage, but in a weapon, in something bigger than they were, something they could wield without truly understanding. The destroyer had proven itself, but Reeves knew this was only the beginning, for the Vakar would not take this lightly. Predators did not give up their prey so easily. Somewhere in the shadows of space, they were already regrouping, already planning, already hungering for the kill. And this time, they would be ready. The Star Destroyer's engines roared as it moved deeper into enemy-held territory, a wedge of fire and steel cutting through the graveyard of Zalari dead. Behind it trailed the hopes of a broken people, rekindled not by honor or song, but by the monstrous power of a myth brought to life. And Reeves could not help but wonder what would be left of the Zalari when this war was over. The first battle had been swift, brutal, decisive, but it was only a taste, a warning shot across the endless void. The Vakar were predators, and predators learned. Reeves knew this as he stood on the Star Destroyer's bridge, watching the wreckage of their enemies drift silently into the graveyard of broken Zalari warships. The Zalari warriors around him cheered, their roars echoing in the cavernous chamber, claws raised to the heavens as if they had been given back their souls. But Reeves did not cheer. He had seen this before, in smaller wars, in quieter places. Victory this absolute was never the end. It was bait. The commander of the destroyer, a towering Zalari with silver scars across his face, turned from the viewport and addressed his warriors. "The Vakar thought us broken. They thought us prey. Now they have learned fear." His voice rumbled like thunder, heavy with pride. "And with this weapon, this gift of the humans, we will not only avenge our fallen, we will wipe the Vakar from existence." The chamber roared in approval. Reeves felt the chill deepen in his bones. He had not expected the Zalari to turn so quickly from despair to zealotry. Their songs had always been of honor, of duels fought and victories earned. But now their voices carried a new edge, one that spoke not of balance or struggle, but of annihilation. They had tasted the destroyer's power, and it had already begun to change them. The next encounter came sooner than expected. Scouts reported a massive Vakar fleet forming at the edge of the Zalari frontier, larger than anything the Zalari had ever faced. Hundreds of ships, perhaps more, gathering like a storm, their black hulls blending with the void. The Vakar had realized they faced a threat unlike any before, and they were coming to crush it before it could spread. The Zalari commander welcomed the news with a feral grin. "Let them come. Let them bring their whole swarm. We will show them what it means to be hunted." Reeves stood at the tactical console, his hands tight around the edge. He watched the enemy formations take shape on the long-range sensors. They moved with unnerving precision, their fleets weaving like a single organism, no ship-breaking formation, no hesitation in their advance. This was not arrogance. This was cold, calculated intent. The Vakar were not simply here to fight. They were here to exterminate. When the fleets met, space itself seemed to shudder. The Star Destroyer emerged from the shadow of a dead star, its triangular hull glowing faintly from reflected starlight. The Zalari ships that remained formed a ragged line around it, battered survivors held together more by stubbornness than steel. Against them loomed the Vakar Armada, hundreds of blade-like ships, their surfaces shimmering with cloaking fields that flickered like waves of shadow. They did not roar or sing or taunt. They simply advanced, silent and merciless, The first shots came from the destroyer. Turbo lasers lit the void, brilliant beams lancing across the battlefield. The nearest Vakar ships evaporated under the barrage, their cloaks collapsing, their hulls torn apart like paper. The Zalari howled in triumph, their claws beating against their chests. The destroyer kept firing, each volley erasing entire wings of enemy craft. Where the Zalari once struggled to track even a handful of ships, the destroyer tracked hundreds at once, its targeting computers locking with inhuman precision. But the Vakar did not falter. For every ship destroyed, 10 more slipped past the barrage, darting like shadows toward the destroyer's flanks. They struck with surgical accuracy, their weapons hammering at weak points in the hull. Shields flared, alarms rang, the deck shook with each impact. Reeves gritted his teeth as consoles flickered. The Star Destroyer was powerful, but it was not invulnerable. The Zalari commander barked orders, his warriors manning the gun stations, their hands clumsy but eager on the controls. They fired wildly at the darting shadows, their roars filling the ship. Some found their marks, Vakar ships exploding in blossoms of fire. Others missed, the enemy slipping away like smoke. Reeves moved quickly between stations, guiding the Zalari through the human interfaces. Not there. Focus on the targeting reticles. Watch the predictive paths, not the ships themselves. Trust the computers. The warrior snarled at his words, unused to relying on machines over instinct, but the results were undeniable. Their accuracy improved, volleys striking with more consistency. One by one, the shadows began to fall. Still, the Vakar pressed harder. Their tactics were merciless. They targeted the destroyer's engines, its shield generators, its weapon banks. They did not care how many of their own they lost. They were willing to bleed endlessly if it meant bringing down the beast that threatened their dominance. The battle raged for hours. Wreckage drifted everywhere, the void littered with the broken remains of ships. The Zalari sang as they fought, their voices hoarse, their eyes wild with fury. For the first time in their history, they fought not as individuals seeking glory, but as one, bound together by the terrible power of the destroyer. They no longer cared for honor or duel. They cared only for victory, no matter the cost. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The destroyer carved through the heart of the Vakar fleet, its massive hull shrugging off blow after blow. Its turbo lasers fired relentlessly, each volley tearing gaps in the enemy formation. The Vakar regrouped again and again, but each time they met only destruction. Their silent precision faltered under the sheer chaos of the destroyer's fury. What had once been a flawless predator now looked desperate, broken by an opponent that refused to die. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Vakar began to retreat. Their ships shimmered into cloak, slipping back into the void, vanishing like smoke on the wind. The battlefield fell silent. The Zalari roared in victory, their voices carrying across the destroyer's decks, echoing into every corridor. They had survived. They had won. The commander turned to Reeves, his eyes burning with a fire that was both triumphant and unsettling. "Do you see, human? Do you see what your gift has given us? With this ship, we are unstoppable. With this ship, we are gods." Reeves said nothing. He looked out at the battlefield, at the endless debris drifting through the void. The wreckage of Vakar ships, yes, but also Zalari vessels broken and burning. Thousands of lives lost in the storm. He thought of Earth, of the council chambers, of the archivist who had suggested sending the destroyer with a shrug and a smile. He wondered if any of them had imagined this. The Zalari warriors sang in triumph, their voices rising into a deafening chorus. But to Reeves, it did not sound like victory. It sounded like the birth of something far darker. For he knew the truth. The Vakar were not defeated. They would return, stronger, smarter, hungrier. And when they did, the Zalari would not turn away. They would meet them again and again, drunk on the power of the destroyer, blind to the cost. And Reeves feared that in the end, it would not be the Vakar who destroyed the Zalari. It would be the very weapon humanity had given them. The battlefield lingered like a wound in the dark, a scar across the frontier that would never fully heal. Wreckage drifted endlessly, fragments of Vakar ships scattered among the corpses of Zalari warriors who had given their lives in the slaughter. Fires still burned in oxygen-rich pockets, little flickers of red and gold that glowed like funeral pyres in the void. The Star Destroyer, scarred but unbroken, hung at the center of it all, its hull lit by the cold light of distant stars. For days afterward, the Zalari did not mourn. They did not weep or honor their dead with quiet rituals. Instead, they sang. Their voices carried through the corridors of the destroyer, deep and thunderous, filling every chamber with echoes of triumph. They sang not of the warriors who had fallen, but of the monster that had carried them to victory. Their verses no longer spoke of duels or personal glory. They spoke of overwhelming fire, of green storms of light that erased the enemy in an instant, of the humans who had given them a god. Reeves listened in silence, standing at the edge of their celebrations. He saw how their eyes gleamed, how their claws tightened with excitement whenever the turbo-laser batteries powered up for another test volley. They were addicted already, intoxicated not by courage or honor but by annihilation. And he could not help but wonder if this had been the plan all along, or if humanity had simply unleashed something it could never take. Back, the commander summoned him one evening to the great viewport at the prow of the ship. Outside, the wreckage drifted silently, broken ships tumbling like leaves in a storm. The Zalari leader stood tall, his silver scars gleaming in the dim light, his gaze locked on the void ahead. "Do you see it, human?" he asked, his voice low and reverent. "See what?" Reeves replied, wary. "The future," the commander said. "The Vakar thought us broken. They thought us finished. But now with this weapon we will rebuild. We will hunt them across every star, drive them from every system, erase their name from the galaxy. The Zalari will rise again, stronger than ever, and when others see what we wield, they will kneel before us." Reeves frowned. "This ship was meant to help you survive, not to conquer." The commander turned to him then, his eyes burning with a fire Reeves had never seen before. "Survival is conquest. Conquest is survival. Do you not understand? The humans have given us the means to ensure our empire will never fall. We will be the hunters, forever." Reeves felt a chill crawl down his spine. He wanted to argue, to remind the commander of honor, of balance, of the cost of such power. But the words caught in his throat. He knew they would fall on deaf ears. The destroyer had already reshaped the Zalari, twisted their culture into something new, something darker. They no longer worshipped their own strength. They worshipped the ship. The Council on Earth received the first reports of victory with cautious relief. The transmission showed Zalari commanders boasting of their triumph, their voices filled with renewed pride. They spoke of the destroyer's power, of how it had turned the tide, of how the Vakar had been driven back. But there was something in their tone that unsettled the diplomats who listened. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to hunger. "They're not thanking us," one diplomat murmured during a debriefing. "They're exalting the weapon. They barely mention their own people, their own sacrifices. It's as if the destroyer is their new god." The chairwoman frowned, her fingers drumming against the polished table. "And if they see it as divine, they will not stop at defending themselves. They will use it to expand, to conquer, to impose their will on others." "Perhaps that's not a bad thing," a general countered. "The Zalari are brutal, yes, but they kept the balance before. If the Vakar are truly as dangerous as these reports claim, perhaps we need a hammer like this to keep them in check." But others shook their heads. What happens when the hammer decides everything looks like a nail? Reeves sent his own reports, more measured, more cautious. He spoke of the Zalari's zealotry, their songs of fire and annihilation, their growing obsession with the destroyer. He warned that they were changing, that their culture was shifting in ways no one could predict. He begged the council to reconsider what they had unleashed. But his words were buried beneath the roar of political debate, lost in the noise of those who saw only short-term victory and not the storm that followed. Meanwhile, the galaxy began to whisper. Other civilizations, once dismissive of humanity, now looked upon them with new eyes. The story spread quickly, carried by rumor and fear. The Zalari had begged for help, and the humans had answered. Not with fleets, not with soldiers, not with mercy, but with a weapon from their own nightmares. A star destroyer, they called it, a ship born not of reality but of human imagination, brought to life in steel and fire. and it had turned the tide of war. Whispers turned to fear. If this was what humanity gave away as a gesture, what horrors did they keep for themselves? What nightmares still slept in their vaults, waiting to be awakened? What other monsters had they built, laughing as toys or experiments? On distant worlds, children began to sing new songs, not of the Zalari or the Vakar, but of the humans who dreamed of gods and then forged them in steel. Merchants spoke in hushed tones, wondering if trade with Earth was worth the risk. Soldiers sharpened their blades and trained harder, their eyes darting toward the stars where humanity dwelled. The Zalari only fueled the rumors. Their transmissions grew more grandiose, their proclamations louder. They called the destroyer the divine hammer, the blade of eternity, the voice of the humans. They declared that with it, they would scour the galaxy of weakness, purge their enemies, and rebuild their empire greater than ever before. And Reeves watched it all unfold with a heavy heart. He saw the warriors grow more reckless, hurling themselves into battles with wild abandon, trusting the destroyer to carry them through. He saw how their rituals changed, how they painted their armor not with the symbols of their ancestors, but with crude likenesses of the great triangular ship. He saw how even the children among the survivors began to speak not of honor, but of annihilation. The destroyer had given them hope, yes, but it had also stolen their soul. One night, Reeves stood alone on the bridge, staring out into the endless void. The stars burned cold and distant, indifferent to the struggles of mortals. He thought of Earth, of humanity, of the strange duality of his people. They dreamed of stories, of heroes and villains, of wars fought in the stars. And then, when the chance arose, they built those dreams into reality. They had always blurred the line between myth and machine, between imagination and truth, and now the galaxy would never forget it. Reeves whispered to himself, so softly that no one else could hear. We should have sent them anything else, medicine, advisors, supplies, anything, but not this. The destroyer rumbled beneath his feet, its engines alive, its turbolasers hungry. Outside, another battle loomed, another fleet of shadows gathering in the distance. The Zalari would sing again, and the galaxy would tremble. And Reeves knew that from this moment forward, humanity would never again be seen as merely human. They would be remembered as the species that dreamed monsters into being, and then gifted those monsters to others. The war was not over. Perhaps it never would be, but the true battle had already begun. The struggle to survive in a galaxy now haunted not by the Vakar, not by the Zalari, but by the specter of humanity's imagination made flesh.